Welcome into the final show of our preseason series. This time we're taking a look at the Sun Belt. Mike, Fun Belt on tap. This may be the shortest conference that we're going to cover, but particularly for college fantasy football, when you're playing full FBS, a conference that certainly can't be ignored, right?
Absolutely. Arkansas State, Troy, there's a bunch of teams that just sling it around the yard. There's a reason it's called the Fun Belt. So let's dive in.
Yeah, let's get into there, man. So let's start off with the Trojans of Troy, Mike. What questions are we going to have, or what questions do we have for them going into preseason camp? A lot of players returning. So I know that, as far as depth, that's not going to be a concern, but what are you looking for particularly in preseason camp?
Yeah, a couple of things. Who's starting quarterback? Gunnar Watson returns, probably has a leg up at this point to be the starter. But they brought in Taylor Powell from Missouri. And I know you don't like to look at, preseason magazines and stuff like that, but we had a couple that gave some indication that Taylor Powell will be a factor in this competition. Gunnar Watson completed 70% of his passes last year, but he didn't attack downfield the way that this Troy offense typically wants to under Chip Lindsey. So I think it's going to be a legitimate quarterback competition. And they didn't put up monster numbers last year, but this is a team under Chip Lindsey the last 2 years that has thrown it 40 times a game. So it's a high volume passing attack. So I'm curious to see who comes out on top there. And then who steps in for Kaylon Geiger in that slot role. It's accounted for 189 targets over the last 2 years. So somebody is going to be relevant in college fantasy. I think we both agree that Reggie Todd's going to be the wide receiver one for now, but a redshirt freshman or sophomore, Tez Johnson, I think is the favorite to start in Kaylon Geiger's spot. He was mentioned recently in that athletic article by Bruce Feldman of those quote unquote athletic freaks, I guess you could say. He's only 150 pounds, but he gets up to 22.5 miles an hour. And he can squat press 3 times his weight. So I know that doesn't necessarily translate to production on the football field, but it's certainly good attributes to have. So I'll also be looking at Tez Johnson and see if he's making some waves.
I was going to ask, how fast can you run, Mike?
12. I don't
know. No. Just having some fun with it. Look, something that happened last year that we're not used to is Troy finishing. They finished up at 3-4, which was last in Sun Belt East. Something we're not used to seeing is, we're not used to seeing Troy finish at the bottom of their division. So yeah, it wouldn't be surprising to me at all, Mike, if we did see a change at the top. We know that they have depth in the backfield with Kamani Vidal, BJ Smith. We know that, like you said, Kaylon Geiger is gone, but they return Reggie Todd. They've got Marcus Rogers, Tez Johnson, still got, Luke Whittemore back. I think they got Barber back. So there's a lot of options there. You just feel like something was missing with Troy last year, but they played in what was the best division of that conference, right? I mean, when you have South Alabama finishing as the second place team over in the West behind UL Lafayette, I think it just really speaks to how imbalanced the Sun Belt Conference is. But for however imbalanced it may be, we're not used to seeing Troy finish there in the bottom. And so for as much depth as they have, they could use that to their advantage this year and try to find the right combinations and put some pieces together. Let's head over to UL Monroe, Mike, where obviously change of the guard there. What are we expecting? We've got a Rich Rodriguez offense now at UL Monroe that changes things up a bit. What are the questions going into 21 for the Warhawks?
I would say who steps in at quarterback, probably. It's pretty clear that this is going to be a transition year. They brought in, 5-6 multiple offensive transfers, defensive transfers, I'm sure too, trying to restock this roster. But typically with the Rich Rod offense, we're focused on the quarterback. It sounds like coming out of the spring, it was Rhett Rodriguez, Rich Rod's son, who had a leg up, and it makes sense. He's probably the best athlete or or one of the better athletes that they have at the quarterback position. The last 5 years that Rich Rod's been an OC, they average 128 carries from the quarterback position. So that's a good sign for possible fantasy production. But I mean, they face Jackson State maybe in the non-conference. Maybe that's a streaming week that we could maybe use Rhett Rodriguez or one of the other skill position players, but not a team this year that I'll be looking to use any of their players.
Yeah, I think for me, I think, you talk about Rich Rod offense, the two positions you're looking for is quarterback and running back. And for me, that's where my focus will be a little bit. I feel that we're more likely to see some fantasy value coming from the running back position this year than the quarterback, because whether or not they have their quarterback in place still remains to be seen. But I know Caden Roach is a player that we've got our eyes on, as well as Andrew Henry, who was a transfer there. I actually prefer Henry at this point. We'll see how preseason camp unfolds, but I like the fact of him coming in there as a transfer and them going out and getting him. I think he may bring a little bit more to the table, but for me, that's just what I'm going to look at, Mike. I think I'm going to look at that running back spot, but much like we say on a lot of the shows up to this point, not sure that's something we're going to invest a preseason pick in right now, but these are things that are going to be, particularly for some of these Sun Belt teams in full FBS formats, things that we're going to be tracking throughout camp and also throughout the beginning of the season. Let's hop over to Texas State, Mike, the Bobcats. Obviously, they're going to sling it around over there in that offense. What are the questions you have, or what is the one question you have about Texas State going into the 2021 season that you're going to be kind of monitoring?
We actually had some news today, or not news, but for these teams in the Sun Belt or in the G5 conferences, particularly Texas State as one example, I tend to look at the message boards, as is it a firm, source that message boards is going to provide concrete news? Probably, not always, but you take what you can get with teams like Texas State. So I was perusing their message board earlier today, and one of their frequent posters said that Ty Evans, the NC State transfer, if the season started today, it sounded like he had access to Texas State practices. It sounded like Ty Evans would be the starter if the season started today. Again, take it with a grain of salt. It's coming from a message board, but when there's not a flood of news articles coming out about Texas State. So they rotated quarterbacks last year with Tyler Vitt and Brady McBride. They threw 26 passing touchdowns last year, and you would expect improvement this year, considering they bring back a lot of their wide receiver core. And it's another year in this and Jake Spavital offense. So I'll be focused on the quarterback. If they can settle on one, maybe that guy's a viable option in college fantasy.
Yeah, I think you and I like Marcel Barbie as a wide receiver one in that offense. Again, he's got some good size and coming off of a solid season. I like where he's being drafted right now, where he's going at about value of where you would expect in drafts. The one guy that I would just say maybe, and this is why I'm keeping an eye on, I really would like to pay attention to that wide receiver too. I think there might be some late value in a player like Javon Banks, who I think could hold some value in that offense, because they're going to certainly throw it around a lot. And we know that Barbie's going to get a lot of attention from the defenses this year. Maybe that opens things up for Banks as well. So I'm with you, Mike. Let's keep our eyes on that quarterback battle. And then also let's kind of see maybe who's going to be some complementary pieces to Marcel Barbie there at the outside, at the receiver position.
Yeah, Rontavious Groves, the North Carolina transfer, was another name that was mentioned, who is he's been a steady presence at the slot receiver role. He could play between Javon Banks and Marcel Barbie. One to watch.
Good point. Arkansas State, Mike, where got some questions here. I'm kind of curious to see where you're going to go with this one.
You could focus on quarterback or wide receiver. I will take the wide receivers, just because that's been a topic of discussion, especially on our Discord. we're both under the impression that Corey Rucker is going to be the wide receiver one. Of course, he had that, infamous now 300-yard 4-touchdown game to close last year. Yes, granted, it happened against Louisiana Monroe, one of the worst defenses in all of college football last year. And it's a limited sample size, but then he also follows that up with a 100-yard performance in the spring game. So, still a limited sample size, but we get more intel from that. Is he a sure thing to be the wide receiver one? No, but, that's our heavy lean right now. If he is the wide receiver one, who's going to be the wide receiver two? Who's going to be wide receiver three? If this remains, the similar offense to what we've seen in years past, because they retained their OC, then there's going to be 2 and 3 options. Is it Tavalence Hunt, the TCU transfer? Jeff Foreman had 3 100-yard receiving performances. That's more evidence than we have for Corey Rucker. Akeem Hayes was brought over by Kentucky as a possible slot guy, and then Dahu Green, who you look back to last year in those handful of games where he was healthy, he was on the field the exact same amount as Jonathan Adams was, and he was heavily targeted in those games as well. So he's going to be a factor as well. So I just really want to see not only 2 and 3, but if Corey Rucker establishes himself as that wide receiver one.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know, when you and I have talked about Arkansas State receivers, I was actually high on Foreman being a breakout player last year. And he did have some nice performances there. Indications out of preseason camp suggest to me, much like yourself, that signs are pointing a little bit in the direction of Rucker. And I'm like you, I've got questions on what's just going on with Dahu Green. And what's going to be his role in the offense, because I do think he was a nice complementary piece last year, but I don't necessarily see him as a go-to receiver, especially knowing the fact that he just, the injury history he has too, right? And so you've got to really rely on a guy like that to stay healthy all year, which is something that's very difficult for him to do. I'm going to go ahead and mention the quarterback race just because you haven't up until this point. We know James Blackman coming over from Florida State. Obviously that's a nice name for the Red Wolves to grab there. Leaves you to believe a little bit that they're not completely sold on Lane Hatcher. But when, it's an interesting take, Mike, because when we look back at stats last year, I mean, Lane Hatcher averaged a nice yards per attempt. He had a nice touchdown to interception ratio, but you still feel like you're not completely sold when you see him. And if we were, would we have seen, and this is something we touched on the Mountain West Conference, right? Would we have seen him split time with Logan Bonner last year, right? And so you said it on the Mountain West show, and if you guys haven't seen it, go back and watch our Mountain West Conference. Logan Bonner going over to Utah State. Mike, the point you made is Blake Anderson has been very loyal to Logan Bonner. And the question is, was Blake Anderson just being really loyal to Logan Bonner last year, or he couldn't decide between the two guys and didn't want to risk losing one? Still a lot of questions in my eyes.
Yeah, I would just rebuttal to the Lane Hatcher take of, his numbers, throwing the football, advanced data was good with the deep ball, right?
Yep.
What is he like in the intermediate and the short and intermediate game? Of course, you're not going to throw a bunch of interceptions when you're just chucking the ball deep every single time, right? And they said it during the spring that Butch Jones wants to put more on Hatcher's plate in terms of, pre-snap reads and on-field adjustments, which I don't just reading articles and message board about him. That's not necessarily his strong suit. Maybe he's improved on that over the offseason, but to call Lane Hatcher a shoo-in at this point would not be correct. It's going to be a competition with him and Black.
I agree. I'm just stating the obvious though with some of the stats, right? He had the 4th best yards per attempt and his 9th, you have to be pretty darn good to, a 19-2 touchdown to interception ratio. I don't know what coaches are going to take that out of their quarterback anywhere within the country, right? So those numbers do impress. But like you said, the offense might have some subtle changes to it under Butch Jones's influence, even though they retain the OC. And it is kind of interesting that they brought in James Blackman from Florida State. So we do have to pay close attention to the quarterback race. If we were a little more certain, here's a good question, Mike, and we'll throw this out for folks with college fantasy football for value, right? ADP. If we were a lot more certain with Lane Hatcher at this point, he'd be a heck of a lot higher up in our rankings, wouldn't he?
Yeah, that's the classic case of projection is going to be higher than rankings, but he falls because I'm not 100% certain that he's going to retain that job, or maybe we see split time between him and Blackman.
Well, I don't think the coaches are quite certain yet. So I think that adds validity to our uncertainty around this position. Mike, let's go over to the state of Georgia and Georgia State with the Panthers this year. A lot of veteran leadership coming back on that offense, man. Returning quarterback, top two backs are returning, top two receivers, and maybe even three if you throw in tight end Roger Carter. What's there not to like about Georgia State this year? But what are the questions do you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, I actually couldn't come up with a question originally for Georgia State, but then I sat and thought about exactly what you said, and I was like, are we too low on Georgia State players right now? I mean, they return all 5 starters along the offensive line. Their entire receiving core for the most part's back. Destin Coates is returning in the backfield. They got an experienced quarterback now. This is a system that we've seen, produce numbers, both wide receiver, running back, quarterback. Everybody's been productive in the past. So, where's Destin Coates? Is he like in the kind of 40 to 50 range, I think, with our running backs, and Pinckney is probably top 50 right now, Sam Pinckney, at wide receiver. Are we too low? Is somebody going to end up popping that we're not seeing right now?
I feel like I know where it's at, Mike. Last year, I was incredibly high on Destin Coates. I was taking Destin Coates in almost every one of our best ball drafts or drafts last year. Early in the year, we got a surprise where Destin Coates, we didn't even get word that he was being held out, and he missed the game. And it seemed like it took him a while to get back into the swing of things. Tucker Gregg stepped in and was having some production in that running back 2 spot. And so for me, I think I would have Coates a lot higher right now if I was just 100% confident that I knew he was just solid, slam dunk, nailed in running back 1 spot. If there's one player that I think I may be undervaluing right now, it might be Destin Coates in that running back 1 spot, knowing what you said, the experience that's coming back, not only on that line, but really they bringing back the entire offense. And that Georgia State offense has shown over the last few years that they can run the ball exceptionally well in that scheme. And I'm wondering if Coates is that guy, Mike, that we're undervaluing a little bit.
Yeah, just to add to that, another guy that maybe we're undervaluing, Cornelius McCoy. I know I mentioned Sam Pinckney, but there's no Fantrax ADP data on McCoy right now. He's not being selected in enough drafts. And I think he was his per game average for targets was higher than Pinckney's last year. So this is a guy that's getting thrown the football quite a bit. And they mentioned today that he's moving to the slot role. He's moved to the slot role in practice. So maybe that opens up some opportunities for him to see even more targets.
Yeah. Well, people forget, I think 2 years ago, McCoy was the leading receiver and then Pinckney was the number 2. And I think they reversed roles last year. So really curious to see how that shakes out for Georgia State this year. But if, any development, I think both you and I are expecting Cornelius Brown to even be better at quarterback this year. And I don't know what's not to like on that Georgia State offense right now, but I'm like you, man. I think we're undervaluing somebody in that offense right now. And if I had to take a guess, I mean, Coates, maybe Cornelius Brown at quarterback, and maybe we're a little lower on the receivers than maybe where their ADP is showing. So that's a good point with Georgia State. A lot to like there and a lot of leadership and experience coming back. Let's go over to Georgia Southern, though, staying in the state, right? We've got news that Justin Tomlin, Mike, will be academically ineligible for the first 2 games of the year. Does that add question marks to where you're looking at in preseason on who might open up at quarterback? Where are your eyes at on Georgia Southern? Because we know it's not at receiver, right?
It's not a receiver, and I'd make the argument it's not a quarterback either. I mean, you have question in terms of who's going to start, because I literally have no clue who's going to be that guy right now. But I was never a proponent of drafting Shai Werts in the past. It's just, this is not the Navy offense where we're focusing on the quarterback here. It's really, the focus is on the running backs, right?
Yep.
And so I'm wondering how that running back rotation is going to shake out. They got 4 starters back along the offensive line. It was a really good line last year. They ran the ball 77% of the time, which was top 5 in the nation last year. How are the carries divided between J.D. King, Logan Wright, both effective running backs, both big running backs, so they can take on a heavier workload. They brought in over Amari Jones from Tulane, but it does not sound like he's a factor right now. He might even play get some reps at wide receiver. And then a player both that you and I like, Gerald Green, who showed a lot of burst in that late in the year in that bowl game last year. So they got 3 or 4 capable guys in the backfield. How's that going to shake out?
Yeah, I'm with you. Same thing. Same question for me. I just think, J.D. King is sort of the veteran presence that's been there. I see where he's going to get every shot to open up as the starter. And I was impressed a lot with Gerald Green, and I had high hopes for Gerald Green going into this 2021 season, but I know that Logan Wright is still there. They bring in Amari Jones from Tulane, which, if you remember Amari Jones over at Tulane, Mike, he did do some damage out of the backfield catching the ball as well. So maybe he does fit a little bit more of that hybrid role where maybe they can give him some carries, maybe some jet sweeps, use him as a receiver. But I'm with you. I'm a little mixed on this. Look, we know that Georgia Southern's going to have a run heavy scheme, right? The question is, how will the distribution of carries play out? Will it be King an overwhelming one, which I think we're in agreement that we're not going to see that. I think we're going to see a mix. But for me, this is one of those teams where I don't think we're going to see a big variance in distribution and carries between 1 and 2 and 1 and 3. I think they've got 3 backs that they're probably going to be able to use quite a bit. And maybe, who knows, Mike, maybe this is a situation where, maybe they're such run heavy. Maybe we see a situation where, hey, they play this out through 2.5 quarters, and hot man gets the carries from there on out. Who knows? Who knows, right? So, but I'm with you. Same questions there. Mike, let's go over to Appalachian State, where over the preseason and offseason, we've had some fun at Chase Brice's expense, who has gone from Clemson to Duke to Appalachian State. One would think going from Duke to Appalachian State might be an improvement, but I'm curious to see how this works out. Chase Brice is a player that I believe led the nation in fumbles lost last year, sacks taken, and also interceptions thrown. That's an interesting fit over at Appalachian State, which sort of has, their MO is really taking care of the ball, running between the tackles, right, and playing solid defense. For me, and I'll start off with this one, everything kind of for me revolves around the progress of Chase Brice and how he fits into that offense, because Appalachian State is probably going to go as far as Chase Brice can be effective and efficient. I know there are other questions, particularly maybe at running back, where the running game is the Appalachian State MO. But for me, I think it all starts with Chase Brice and his development through preseason camp. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'll be focused on the backfield. Again, every single year that they've been at the FBS level, they have a 1,000-yard rusher. Bring back a lot of depth in that backfield with Deidre Harrington, Nate Noel. They brought over a Notre Dame transfer, and Jameer Smith. So they got 4 capable backs in that backfield. I want to see if there's a firm pecking order between the 4, or maybe we see closer to a committee approach. I've been avoiding Cameron Peoples for the most part in drafts just because of his ADP sitting at running back 19. He got some turnover along the offensive line. You got to downgrade, in my opinion, at quarterback in Chase Brice. And you got a running back or a system that they don't throw to their running backs too much. So while I really like Cameron Peoples, it's just not somebody I'm gonna spend up at running back 19 to go try and snag, just because there's a lot of concerns, in my opinion, with reasons I just mentioned.
Well, I think it's warranted, right, Mike? I think, there's going to be a lot of guys that reflect back to last year and are going to be thinking what Peoples did in that bowl game against North Texas. But let's be honest, they're not going to be playing against a North Texas defense every week. And for as much as I believe it's going to be Peoples, Noel 1-2, and Smith is there to kind of provide depth because of Marcus Williams leaving to go off to Louisiana Tech, we won't know for sure until we start seeing it a little bit. And so I'm with you. I haven't gotten a ton of Cameron Peoples shares as well. His ADP, I think he's going around where he's probably should be. And much like we talked with Destin Coates, right? Maybe we're undervaluing him a little bit, just knowing the Appalachian State historically and what running back ones can do there. What about going down to South Alabama, Mike, where offensive coordinator Major Applewhite has brought in a couple of new pieces, particularly at quarterback and at running back, with Kareem Walker at running back, Jake Bentley, the former South Carolina / Utah quarterback. They even brought in Allen Daly, wide receiver from Kentucky. So they're doing some things to build that offense up this year. What are your questions for the Jaguars going into the new season?
Wide receiver 2. No questions regarding Jalen Tolbert. That's a top 5, top 10 receiver this year. But under Applewhite, there's always been a relevant wide receiver 2. And it's typically been the slot guy. And just looking back, whether it was Lionel Bonner back at Houston, Marquez Stevenson, DeMarcus Ayers, it's typically been the slot guy that has been the second leading receiver on that team, which averaged 58 receptions in those seasons. So is that a guarantee to happen? No, but that's a spot where I think we need to look at. And I've kind of planted my flag with Colin Lacey, a redshirt freshman or sophomore, a second-year player. Really good speed. He's got versatility. He can line up in the backfield a little bit. And he's gotten praise from the coaches, but we haven't gotten that confirmation that he's going to be that next guy after Tolbert. You mentioned Daly's been brought in. Jalen Wayne is back from suspension from during the spring. He's impressed the coaches and done everything that he's needed to over the summer. So they do have four capable receivers. I'm hopeful, just to kind of boost up my rankings, that Colin Lacey emerges as that second guy, but I'll be looking for that this camp.
Yeah, I think, we're going to be looking for the same thing. I think if I'll go in a different place, it's just, how quickly does Jake Bentley adapt into that offense? I know, I've seen some doubters about Jake Bentley, about, he couldn't do it here, he couldn't do it there, and then he comes over to South Alabama. Look, I don't think the Sun Belt is as bad as the MAC. I do like the defenses in the Sun Belt. I do think that it is a very I like some of the competition, particularly in the top half of the Sun Belt Conference, but I like what he's got at weapons over there. People forget that Jake Bentley was a decent quarterback a couple of years ago at South Carolina. He laid an egg, obviously, over at Utah, but man, I'm thinking, maybe what the Gamecocks wouldn't do right now to have him, because he'd probably be the best quarterback on their roster right now, at least from throwing the ball. They'd at least have a passing game. So, and that's what Major Applewhite's offense requires, right? Just a quarterback to be able to get the ball into the hands of the receivers. And Jalen Tolbert, who we have as one of the top fantasy receivers going into the new season. And so I do think that Jake Bentley is a little bit flying under the radar as a Sun Belt Conference quarterback in full FBS leagues. What about over to Louisiana, Mike, where we go with UL Lafayette? We'll go with the Raging Cajuns down there. Where do you questions for UL going into the new season here?
Yeah, we're going to have the same question. I feel like it's going to be who's that running back to? I've seen elsewhere that people are much higher than us even, and we have Chris Smith as a top 30, top 35 back, that they're higher on Chris Smith just because they think, all that vacated production from Elijah Mitchell and Trey Regas, that that he's all of a sudden now going to be the bell cow in that backfield. And that's simply just not true. I have a question for you, Joe. How many times did Elijah Mitchell top 20 carries in a game in his 4 seasons at Louisiana?
In his 4 seasons, I would probably say no more than on average twice, but I'd say a little bit more over the last 2. If I'm going to go total, I would not say more than 7 or 8.
Yeah, you were on it 3 times. 3 times he topped 20 carries a game in 4 seasons. So they're simply going to split that backfield between 2 and 3 options. We need to figure out who those options. We know who those options are going to be. We need to figure out a pecking order. I think we're not in agreement here. I think you like the Texas A&M transfer, Jacob Kabadi, where I like Amani Bailey preferably. So we need to figure out who that guy is going to be. You're looking at 150 carries from that second guy if recent history is any indication. So we need to figure that out.
Well, I think we also have to keep in context too, Mike, with Trey Regis, Elijah Mitchell, Chris Smith even got a decent amount of touches as running back 3, right? So I would say that, we're looking at 3 backs in that rotation, but I'm like you, it's hard. I think the reason why we're seeing someone projecting Chris Smith as a bell cow right now is just because no one has clarity on who's the running back 2 is going to be right now. And when I think we get some clarity on that, I think we'll have a better idea. But you're right. I don't think you're looking at, and we could be wrong, because if we're wrong here, Chris Smith is going to be one hell of a fantasy back this year. But I do think with the way that offense operates, we tend to rely on historical systems and play calling. And the system just hasn't proven that they're going to have a back that's going to average 20 carries a game in that offense. So the running back 2 definitely will be the most watched position that you and I are going to have eyes on going into throughout preseason camp and going into the new season. Mike, let's end up with the conference champions, Coastal Carolina Chanticleers. I'm going to kind of give you the stage on this one because I have a feeling I know where both you and I stand on Coastal Carolina going into the preseason. So the stage is yours, man. Where are we? What are we looking for going into the new season?
Who's running back 1? And I think we have a really good idea that it's going to be Reese White. I was questioning it a little bit this spring. Reading a couple of articles, you saw that CJ Beasley, the redshirt freshman, was the running back being named in these articles, and he got some praise from the coaching staff. I didn't see anything on Reese White. But then, reading more articles throughout the summer and going into the fall camp, you're starting to see more indications that it's going to be Reese White. And the reason you have to do that is because we had really no idea for the most part that it was going to be Grayson McCall as the quarterback 1 last year. I mean, I don't know what the beat writer was doing over there, sipping Mai Tais at Myrtle Beach, right? We have to kind of do that sort of digging because we're not going to get the sort of reporting that we get from an Alabama. So, I'll be focused on the running back. They bring back 10 starters and the only one lost is CJ Maribel. So, yeah. I mean, it's really all we're focused on, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think for me, it may not be. If I'm going to go in one step farther on your question is, will White get the workload that we've seen CJ Maribel have in the past? And really that's what it comes down to. When you look at their schedule, the Citadel, Kansas, Buffalo, UMass, ULM, Arkansas State to start the year, that's a golden schedule, right? So you can see why a lot of us are really high on Grayson McCall. Now we want to know, is Reese White going to get that type of CJ Maribel workload, or will they sort of piece things off a little bit? And so for me, that's what I'm going to kind of be keeping my eyes on in preseason camp there.
I mean, yeah, the flip side, it's that easy schedule and yeah, that will work in Grayson McCall and Reese White's favor. But if they're steamrolling these opponents,
yeah,
and they like that depth, and maybe the coaches really do like CJ Beasley, maybe we see, Beasley involved and Shamari Jones involved. So it can work in both directions with that easy schedule.
Yep. Well, that's going to do it, Mike. That puts a bow not only on this show, but it puts a bow on the preseason series that we've had with questions on every conference, man. Look, the season's just a couple of weeks away before we start getting into creating some of the week zero content. You and I, we talked about it before we loaded up this show and got and started recording. Our eyes now are going to be focused on camps all throughout the country and kind of following the news that comes in, not maybe so on a daily basis, but on weekly basis as well. Keeping our eye on all the position battles that you and I have highlighted throughout this series. I mean, look, I think we covered it all, man. I mean, we never really left everything off, and we've kind of given everyone a glimpse of what you and I are really going to be monitoring, which is quite a bit. You take all these shows and kind of piece them together. There's a lot to scour the web on. There's a lot to scour Twitter on. There's a lot that we're going to be watching for, and that's just what we love doing, man. And so, you know, a preseason series in the books. Anything you want to add before we get out of here, man?
If you've signed up, jump on the Discord, because both Joe and I are posting news blurbs throughout the day for the most part. So you need to be on the Discord to stay up to date with all the pertinent news that we're looking for in these upcoming weeks. And we're ready for the season to start.
Like Mike said, that Discord server that we have is approaching 400 strong. I wouldn't even be surprised if we get that number up towards 500 by the time we kick off the season. From breaking injury news to discussing DFS to college fantasy football news in general to team pages, the Discord server has it all. It is the biggest one spot location for the college fantasy football community. If you're not a member, become an All-American member, Heisman member today, get instant access to that Discord server, and you get all the access to the preseason content that we have up until this point. Mike, that's going to do it for the series. We're going to see a bunch of you guys in the Discord server through the emails that we have as well. And we hope to get a few more of you, or a lot more of you, in, you know, as you're preparing for your drafts over the next couple of weeks. So for Mike Bainbridge, my name is Joe DeSalvo. That's going to do it for the preseason series, Mike. Tongue twisted and tied up, but we got through it, man. See ya.